Welcome to Unfixed. This podcast explores the intersection of artificial intelligence and the institution of higher education. I am Zach Justice, Professor of Communication Studies and Director of Faculty Development.
And I'm Nik Janos, Professor of Sociology.
We are employees of Chico State, and we will discuss some of our work, but this podcast is not affiliated with Chico State, and the views expressed here are not representative of the university.
Zach, how's it going today?
A little warming up in Chico, but I'm doing okay. How about you, my friend?
I'm doing great. Imagine an institution that for almost 1,000 years has been doing its thing in its public and more modern form, maybe about 60 to 150 years old. This institution had quite a simple value proposition. Come here and you will learn and grow, and at the end, you'll be smarter, you'll have a degree to show for your work. Generation after generation this went on. Never free of politics, of course. But now imagine these old lumbering institutions are facing a pincer attack on at least 4 fronts: political, economic, cultural, technological, from right-wing attacks, left-wing attacks, to declining public support, to enrollment cliffs, and the fountain of government support coming to a trickle. Then, in the fall of 2022, generative AI was unleashed on the world. And in few places has its impact been greater than on the university. These are the conditions that Zach and I are calling the insecure university. In this episode, we're going to discuss this condition, explore the enrollment crisis, the political attacks, think about how COVID has also reshaped the university, and then have a conversation about the introduction of generative AI and what it means for higher ed. Zach.
That is a lot, Nick, and we're going to take these one piece at a time. Our first segment that we're going to cover is the enrollment cliff. Now, I remember going to talks and conversations on our campus and at conferences about the coming enrollment cliff going back 10 years. So this is something that we've known has been coming, but hasn't always been felt and has oftentimes been poorly defined. So if you're unfamiliar, the enrollment cliff has to do with shifting demographics in America, and this is not the same in every region. But the more rural, oftentimes mid-century industrial areas of the country and a lot of agricultural areas of the country have seen declining birth rates going back about 20 years. And if you look at actuarial tables, one of the things that you saw is that about this time, we start to see this precipitous drop-off of college-age students in regions a lot like the one that Chico State exists in, a rural agricultural region. And we've already seen this and the implications of this in different areas, especially in the Midwest and Northeast, where we've seen the closure of several liberal arts institutions, oftentimes small private institutions. And it's really starting to hit even large and mid-sized state institutions like our own. Now, like I said, it is not the same everywhere. In the sunnier parts of the country, in the Southwest and in the Southeast, demographics are different, and part of that is fueled by immigration, but there are more college-age people, oftentimes in the universities can accommodate. But we have the opposite problem as you get further north, and we have fewer students and more seats. And so we're experiencing that as this dramatic decline in college-age students and then in students that end up enrolled at the university. And this has been compounded by financial stresses and also decrease in public funding. Because institutions like ours get our money from a couple of different places, but we've seen drop-offs in both the public funding and enrollment. So that's the sort of enrollment cliff, or that sort of pressure in a nutshell.
How do you think that intersects with another issue where we hear that it's not just that there's fewer college-bound kids or the age of college-bound kids, but there are a growing, or at least a sizable portion of kids who could go to college who just decide not to go to college? What's fueling that?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, and it's a complicated one. We've all heard anecdotes about this with a couple of different sort of animations. One of them is there is a swath of folks from elite families, wealthy families, that just don't go to university when 20 years ago they all would have gone. Mm-hmm. And there are definitely people, especially, and this is a little bit uncouth to say, but especially young white men who opt not to enter the higher education sector. And they sort of leave high school, enter the workforce, or oftentimes enrolled perhaps part-time at a community college, but without an eye towards a degree transfer, or with a sort of trade certificate like HVAC or automotive or something like that. They're just sort of in betwixt and in between, oftentimes for like a decade. Mm-hmm. And we can get into later some of the political and demographic forces that are pushing people in that direction. But yeah, there's definitely a swath of people across demographics that are opting out of higher ed that 20 years ago were almost all opting in.
It also makes me think about another problem is retention. And a couple of years ago, a study showed that in the CSU system, like 1 in 3 students were food insecure, right? And we hear stories about students living in their cars. Housing costs are high in places like California, where we are. Chico used to be a pretty relatively inexpensive place. So we had a lot of students coming up from the Bay Area, mostly Los Angeles actually, to come to school here because it made sense. So in the opening, I talked about that value proposition. It also seems like there's an economic twist where as school is more expensive, food, housing become more expensive, fewer students can stay even in college.
Yeah, and that has obviously coincided with a rise of different forms of education. There are more options for online education. And one of the things that that's done is if you have secure housing in one place, then you're less likely to move somewhere else to have extra expense, housing, perhaps food insecurity, when you can continue to live with your grandparents or whoever it is that you are living with and be in a more secure situation. That has produced additional pressure on regional comprehensives, places like Chico State, like these large flagship institutions that rely on people coming to the campus in order to meet enrollment targets.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's another side to this, and the enrollment cliff almost feels like this immovable force of demographics. But we also know that, for a long time, but increasingly there's political attacks. And I think part of the pincer movement on the university is coming both from the right wing and from the left wing. And someone who's spoken a lot about this is Niels Gilman. He was on the Theory of Change podcast. He had a really interesting deep dive into how the right has used politicization and to stoke sort of controversies, this hot button issues on university campuses around whether it's DEI or free speech or race and all these kinds of things. And that universities and the people who work there often take that bait and kind of pour fuel into the fire. So take us through a little bit of this right-wing attack that's also putting pressure on universities.
Yeah, first, Nick, I just want to say that I appreciate that as part of this sort of second segment, you have identified that these sort of pressures they're politically valenced, but they aren't one directional, that they do come from the left and the right. So we're going to cover both. Nick's asked me to talk a little bit about the right-wing movement. And I just want to start by saying that this is not a new phenomenon. I recently read William F. Buckley's God, Man, and Yale, which was his first book that he published, 1951. So a full 75 years ago at this point. And it was about his experience as an undergraduate at Yale. And if you don't know Buckley, he was the founding editor of National Review, a sort of central figure on the fusionist right-wing consensus in the latter half of the 20th century and well into the 21st century. And it's so interesting. You can draw a direct line from the criticisms that he's making of Yale and of higher education broadly in 1951, all the way through the current avatar of that movement, which is Christopher Rufo from the Manhattan Institute. These criticisms about the universities not fostering intellectual diversity, favoring collectivism over individualism, and an aversion to faith, specifically the Christian faith. And so these sort of attacks aren't necessarily new. I think that they are amplified by the social media era and definitely by how polarized the society is. But at the same time, you could say that same thing about the post-World War II moment and the dawn of the Red Scare, right? I'll bet that everybody then thought they were living through a polarized time as well. But I want to call out one particular quote from Chris Rufo in an article that he wrote for the City Journal, because he really, one of the things that I appreciate about Rufo, even though there's a lot that I disagree with, is that he's willing to say the quiet part out loud that a lot of people sort of encode. And he says in the City Journal, the political right has to come to accept that if there must be a civil rights regime, it should be one of its own making. And this builds on a theme that Rufo talks about consistently, which is that people who have a problem with woke universities or diversity, equity, and inclusion, he oftentimes says what you really have a problem with is civil rights law, and we need to rewrite civil rights law. And so that gives you an inkling of the totality of that project, as well as how seriously they are taking it. And I think maybe before this last election, a lot of us didn't realize quite how serious they were about higher education. But we've seen several moves from forcing people to close equity centers to the attack on federal grant funding. And one of the interesting ones, and one where I oddly find myself aligned with the political far right on this, is the tax and the attacks on the endowments of these enormously profitable places that are ostensibly higher education institutions.
Well, it's kind of a crossover with a left-wing critique.
Absolutely.
So while that's been happening all the way back to 1951 with Buckley, and it's been different permutations from the right, and now, with the Trump administration actually taking policy moves as well, the left has also been uneasy with modern higher education, going back, probably to the 60s as well. But what we've seen at the same time that the new right, and the sort of, left that we currently have, the university finds itself in the middle of a critique from the left that it's just an institution that is furthering the needs of capitalism and the free market, corporations. Like, we're just mills to create a new workforce, a new labor force that's disciplined to slot into all of the corporate jobs or whatever kind of jobs that companies need in the economy. That it kind of keeps rolling the neoliberal logic of the market will kind of solve all our problems. Of course, as always, the left-wing critique has always been also around elitism and how it reproduces both cultural elites and economic elites, and particularly, of course, the Ivy Leagues and their role in sort of the reproduction of class power. Debt has always been, so as public money kind of dissipated over the last 20 years or so, private debt to fund higher education. The left has been very critical of that. The funny thing is that the right says that the universities are full of leftists, and there's probably overrepresentation for sure. But actually, if you talk to a lot of people in the university who would consider themselves on the left, they're actually not defenders of the university. They have deep-seated critiques of the institution they even work for that sometimes are as animated and as deeply motivating as the ones on the right. So it kind of made me think, what is the university? Who supports the university? And there was a blog post by Venkatesh Rao. He has a Substack called Contraptions. And he has this new piece out called Knowledge Under Siege. It's part of a series where he's actually using generative AI to co-produce blog posts, which I think is kind of cool. But I just want to read real quickly from this, because I think this kind of helps us see the vulnerability of the institution of the higher education find themselves in. He says, in prior centuries, the university was attacked because it stood in the way. Today, it is attacked because it no longer does. This inversion marks a profound shift. The university is no longer necessary to dismantle in order to replace it. It's already being replaced by artificial intelligence systems that mimic expertise, by platforms that disaggregate teaching from institutions, by cultural narratives that cast intellectual authority as ideological capture. The political attack in this new regime is not about seizing control of the university as a site of power. It's about accelerating its symbolic collapse. I thought that was very sort of evocative of the kinds of insecurities that the university is facing in the political dimension. By the way, all of the links that we're mentioning in the articles today, they're all going to be in the show notes.
I don't want to leave this segment just yet. And hearing that quote and hearing you talk about it makes me think, and this is a pressing question, not for you, but for both of us. What is our political power base? Because it's not the far right and it's far left, right? Like, do we need to lean into being a neoliberal institution?
Right. I think, if you were to think about it from a political standpoint, it actually goes back to the segment just before this on the enrollment cliff. Ideally, your political base would be young people and their families who value and favor education, and the society at large, taxpayers who say, you know what, these are institutions that actually make our society better. But if that's waning, and you have political factions that are also attacking it, are we just left with corporations that say, yeah, we need the workers, so here's some money? I don't know. Maybe we'll save that one for irresponsible speculation.
No, I think one day you're going to apply for a university presidency, and that's going to be your pitch to the board. Like, I will be the Bank of America president.
I'm sure that's already starting to happen, right? Now,
yes,
it would. We can laugh, but unfortunately, there's more, right?
Yeah. Well, wait,
there's more.
Yeah.
Because guess what happened? 5 years ago. What happened 5 years ago?
Yeah. Call now, and I'll also put you on board for a global pandemic that was a systematic shock to higher education. We don't want to laugh about a global pandemic in which lots of people died, but the alternative is crime, both because it was tragic and because of this acceleration of online education. And we don't want to downplay the economic and the loss of life of that, but this is a higher education focused podcast. So we're really focused on the institutional impact on higher education. But we do, of course, want to acknowledge the sort of political and life disruption that happened with the pandemic.
Absolutely.
Higher education was already dealing with problems of enrollment, this political ill positioning. And then 5 years ago, the global pandemic hits, and it had a sort of unusual hit on the on higher education systems. One of them is that there was a rapid acceleration of the move to online education. Now, that was already partially in process. Nick, the program that you teach in already has had online components since
but like the 1990s.
Yeah, since the dawn of the internet, right? But now suddenly we're all online educators, whether we want to be or not. Lots of faculty and students never returned. Mm-hmm. Nick and I talk about this all the time. We come to campus regularly, and oftentimes we don't see a lot of the same people that we saw 10 years ago when we were on campus. And the dorms aren't as full, and the dining halls aren't as full. Some of the students aren't there.
Faculty offices aren't as full.
Faculty offices are shut and locked a lot of the times. Yeah. And so there has been no return to normal. We are in a new normal in higher education. I'm not sure I'm a big fan. I don't know about you.
Yeah.
But it has highlighted how precarious our institutions are. And the other thing, and I've said this so many times, I can't remember whether I shared this in the podcast or not, but one of the outcomes of the pandemic is that universities and colleges have to realize we're all competing in an online marketplace, even if we're offering in-person classes.
Yeah.
We teach at Chico State, a regional comprehensive university. I would bet my last dollar that there are students living within walking distance of Chico State that are enrolled in online universities in some other part of the country.
Yeah.
And so we like to think about ourselves as, students are on campus and it's beautiful and there are trees and, come to the baseball game. And that can all be true, but it's also true that then we are competing where we used to have a functional monopoly.
Well, let me tell you a quick little story on that. So you mentioned that the sociology program here at Chico State has an online component going back to the late 90s, and that's true. And one thing that the pandemic radically changed for us is that we used to teach in these special technology rooms in the basement of the library, where we'd have 40 students in front of us, like physically in front of us. We'd have another 10 to 15 on Zoom. And then we'd have another 10 to 15 who were sort of going to watch the archive, and we'd record it all. And it was this really like multimodality kind of experience. And it was fantastic. It met our needs as educators because we had people in front of us. We could meet the people who could come in live on Zoom, who got that, feeling of being there in the room. And then the people who need to serve that have jobs and families that had to watch the archive. The pandemic destroyed this, Zach, because the in-person students realized, well, why would I schlep myself to campus and get dressed and brush my teeth when I could just be like all those other students and I could just be in my pajamas watching on Zoom?
And also, you remember there was that window where if you were going to be on campus and in person, you had to wear a mask.
Yeah.
Or I can be at home and not wear a mask.
Exactly. And so we kept going with that even after the pandemic. And guess what? Who showed up in-person class? Like 2 people, because they all just would say, I'm just going to watch the archive. And we could, mental model like, no, you live in Chico. You have to be here in person. And then they would say, yeah, well, what are you going to do about it? Right? So profound changes. So we canceled all of that. And now we're trying to get people you have to be in class if you're a Chico State student. And it's not a topic for this episode, but maybe later at some other episode, we could talk about dual programs where you have this in-person program that starts looking and feeling and acting different than a fully online program.
I want to make one point to tie back to our first segment before we get to our last one. And that's that this does tie back into enrollment cliff situations because the truth is we need students more than they need us right now. And so when they say, I don't want to come in person, what we have to do is say, and that's totally fine. We're happy to accommodate and make that happen.
Yeah.
When probably 20 years ago, we don't do that. We tell them what to do.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Nick, what's our last depressing segment?
Well, so if we thought the pandemic, was a challenge, of course, for higher education, if not, of course, a global, disaster, but only, 2 years into the pandemic, in November of 2022, company that none of us had heard of, OpenAI, right? Maybe a few of you who have been reading the tech news, released ChatGPT, right, to the world. And so at the same time that we have this decade enrollment decline and public support decline and state support decline and these intense political attacks from the left and the right and a global pandemic upends the business model and proposition of university itself, in comes a tool that basically can think and act and do like a student, if not a professor themselves, right? So I think that is, when we started writing about and now speaking about generative AI, this was always in the context that we understood that when generative AI came into the university, it wasn't coming into an institution that was healthy, that was secure, and that was strong. Now, I think if the university had been all 3 or even one of those 3 things, I think the conversation around generative AI would be different, but it didn't. It came in at a time, maybe some of the lowest periods of its entire 1,000-year history in some ways, right? So I think that's the next context. How do you feel? What are you thinking about that aspect of it?
Yeah, when we had conversations about this initially, the analogy that I drew was to, if you've ever watched a boxing match or a mixed martial arts match or even a sporting event that wasn't a combat sport, and you see a team or an individual that has they've just been hit and they've hit the canvas and then they've been hit and then they get up again and then you're like, are they going to get up again? And then they get up and then you're on the edge of your seat because you're thinking maybe that was the last one, maybe the next one's going to be the last one. And we kind of felt like that's where we were. And we don't just say that to be depressing. I think that is important for people to understand because it gives context to how it is that we in higher ed reacted. And one of the ways that we reacted was frustration because everybody was understandably so tired and feeling embattled.
Oh, and that's the empathy I have for all of my colleagues and any of you who work in universities out there who are listening to this, is that we all feel that. We're at a point in which we see the crises piling up, and they have been for quite a while, and that's demoralizing. Any one of these crises is enough to send us into sort of that existential, like, what are we doing here? And this one, I think, is sort of like, that coup de grace that comes in where we're at our weakest, as you were just mentioning, and really just kind of knocks us all flat, right? But, I've got some thoughts about how we could respond, and so what do you, I know we've been going on sort of like these one hit after another, but what are the sort of ways that we can regain some agency and control right? Because this podcast has been about the kind of ways the university is being disrupted. But maybe it's time to also reflect on, well, with all of these crises piling up, we're kind of shaking, we're about to fall over. What do we do next?
Well, I do think in my personal life and in my professional life, I am a firm believer in these sort of self-help, focus on the things that you can control and maximize those, right? I cannot control what Chris Rufo tweets, and I can't control the critiques of the university that come from the left. And I certainly don't have any control over demographic trends that started 20, 30, 40 years ago, right?
Yeah.
But some of this stuff, like our reaction to the dawn of artificial intelligence, we do have control over that. Over what we do, how we position ourselves, what it is that we can do. So I'm sympathetic to my colleagues who feel a sense of overwhelm. I am sympathetic to that. At the same time, I want to see us focus on and do work on the areas where we can control and not spend all our time wringing our hands about stuff that is just well beyond our capacity.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And actually, I'll add something that's a little different. I was driving this morning in the car, just kind of thinking about the episode that we were going to record, and I started getting kind of excited because I started thinking about a builder moment, like where we actually get to build something, not just be part of an institution that's been around for 60 years, like our case, or 1,000 years, like the institution of higher education itself, but a real opportunity to actually be part of something where we're building, not just maintaining. And to me, that's exciting. Like, I think if there's a way that we can embrace some of this disruption to actually come together to figure out what we're going to build next, it means that we have some new renewed purpose when we go to work, because we're like constructing the next thing and not just maintaining the way that life has been going on, university has been going on for generation after generation.
Nick, that's such an interesting observation. And that reminds me, I had this aversion to a return to normal that people kept talking about after COVID from the start, right? And I think you just put your finger on why I never liked that phrase, because I always just felt like, no, we have to come out of this and do something different, not be nostalgic for how things were in 2018.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we've depressed and speculated enough, or have we? Nick, is it time for some irresponsible speculation?
Yes, it is time for irresponsible speculation. It kind of gets us back to this. Do we even have it in us to do this, to meet to this challenge?
Okay, so we didn't decide this in advance. So I'm going to put you on the spot first. Do we have it in us? Are we dragging ourselves off the canvas? Are we getting back out onto the pitch, even though we're down 3-0 and it's the second half?
Well, the university is a blessing and a curse. And that is related to the fact that there's an overrepresentation of extremely smart and capable and agile people, even in an institution that's extremely slow and molasses-like in its structure. So I think there are going to be flourishes, and this is not across the board as like all university systems, but I think there are going to be systems and people who figured it out and who do pivot and do rise to the occasion. And that is going to involve new kind of institutional structures being constructed, breaking of old norms, reconstituting them. Of course, I want to see this done in the most democratic and participatory way as possible, and not sort of autocratic, or not just turn over the keys to Shell Corporation or something. But I think there is latent in there the capacity to do it. I think it's just going to be very messy, and some will fail and some will succeed in doing and changing this fast. Yeah. What about you?
So first, if Shell does want to sponsor this podcast, we aren't going to say no. So just we're going to have that conversation.
He's joking.
No, I mostly agree in that I do think that some institutions are going to make their way out of this, and I think there are some that aren't. And I think it's going to be accelerated from some of these demographic cliff closures that we saw even before the pandemic happened. But I know you were saying you want it to be democratically driven, and I'm not sure what I hope for. I think it will be largely market driven. I think that we are in a competition for students that we have not experienced before. And I think the institutions that are going to be able to make themselves attractive to students and show that they are adapting to this environment are going to be successful. And the ones that don't are going to find a way to shutter the doors.
Yeah, that's hard to argue with that, but
Yeah.
all right.
All right, that was Irresponsible Speculation, brought to you by Shell. No, it was not.
Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. You can find our writing on meltsintooair.org and connect with us on Blue Sky at meltsintooair.bsky.social and on LinkedIn, Zach Justice and Nik Janos. Find these links and more in the show notes. If you have feedback or want to share an idea, email us at unfixed@meltsintooair.org. Thank you to Jamie Gunderson for producing and editing the show.